Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Brothers and sisters of the P&T, automation! My God, there's hardly any topic that's as fraught and poorly misunderstood in technology studies as automation. So many assumptions about how it works and how significant it has been. And yet, especially from historians, there's been so little strong research on the topic. Two moments made this stand out for me. First, do you remember the earlier AI bubble that happened around 2014 and 2015 when books like McAfee and Brynjolfsson, The Second Machine Age, and Ford's Rise of the Robots, and the World Economic Forum's Fourth Industrial Revolution stuff were claiming that we were on the cusp of a period of tremendous, world-altering technological change that would lead to huge productivity growth and potentially troubling technological unemployment? Well, that never seemed to show up. And then, second, on the flip side, there was the work of economist Robert Gordon and others that was showing that for most of the period since the 1970s, productivity gains had remained frustratingly low, and that for all the hype and guff, digital technology did not seem to be leading to that many gains. Still true today, by the way. And what did folks in empirical technology studies, including what is sometimes called STS, have to say about this? Well, there were important earlier works like Amy Sue Bix's book from 2000, Inventing Ourselves Out of Jobs, America's Debate over Technological Unemployment, 1929 to 1981. But I think for the most part, the answer to this question is mostly nothing. A lot of technology studies had mostly nothing to add to these conversations. And I think we can say why this is the case, that, for example, in the late 1980s and 1990s, the history of technology, STS, and other fields tacked away from studies of industry and work and towards things like intellectual history, cultural history, studies of emerging technologies, identity-focused accounts, and so on and so forth. The end result is that, you have like this long-standing debate between Eric Brynjolfsson on the one hand saying digital technology is changing everything, just you wait and see, and Robert Gordon on the other hand saying, I've been waiting for 20 years, bro, show me the money. And then you have lots of areas of technology studies, including the history of technology, who have fuck all to contribute to the conversation. That is a grievously ugly situation. Mercifully, it is changing. First of all, we have good books like former guest Aaron Beninov's Automation of Future Work, and some junior scholars have turned to the study of automation and work. In this conversation, I talked to two of them. Salem Elzway is a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at University of Southern California, and Jason Resnikoff is an assistant professor of contemporary history at the University of Groningen. We use a co-authored piece they had published in the journal Labor titled Whence Automation? The History and Possible Futures of a Concept as the launching point for our conversation, including diving into their individual research agendas on the history of automation. Now, personally, I love it when we see historians who are working on similar topics, collaborating together, being friends together, instead of acting competitively and turf-like. And I am super stoked that we have this burgeoning inquiry into the history of technological change, management, work, and economy. And that's why I say to you, hey, get excited! Salem and Jason, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks for having us.
So, Whence Automation, I think we've needed an article like this for a long time, frankly. And, it's really neat and interesting. if you were explaining it to a stranger, what would you say the article is about, and what were you trying to do in it?
Yeah, I would say the article is mostly about trying to problematize and trouble the waters of what most historians think automation is as a concept. The way that we can use the analytic to think through technological change, its effects on labor, and the politics derived from there. So definitely, it was something that me and Jason kind of stumbled upon when we came together at a conference, and realized that we had
Okay.
very joint interests. And we were invited to actually try to write something up about our shared ideas and our shared work. And I think we stumbled upon a really nice way of approaching the concept as we think it, and trying to get historians to think in new ways about it.
Very cool. Jason, go.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think Salem said it all. I think we're both of us were encountering is that we were both independently working on projects about automation, and then we found each other. And it was one of those sort of, it's like a bit of kismet. We're talking to one another. And instead of saying, I disagree, like, oh, yeah, you're right. And I was like, you're right. No, you're right. It would be kind of, it's a virtuous
Yeah.
circle. And I think, and I don't want to speak too much for Salem, so, you tell me if I'm wrong, but we're finding that a lot of historians would consider automation as a kind of historical force in itself. You find that even not histories that aren't so old, like automation was happening and therefore the workers were fired. Often a kind of technological determinism,
Yeah.
especially with labor historians who aren't often initiated into STS,
Yeah.
science technology studies. And so I think, just as Salem said, one of the things we wanted to do was to say this is not a historical force in and of itself. It's a subject of history. History needs to explain it. It doesn't explain history, at the very least. And that's one of
Yeah.
the things we try to do with that article.
Yeah, and can you? So I really like this setup so far. And can you all say a little bit more about? Well, first of all, I just want to say I love the way you guys partnered on this, and I think that we need a lot more of this in academia. Another famous example to me is that both the historians David Kirsch and Geis Moms were working on electric vehicles. It turned out at the same time. And instead of being territorial about it, which believe me, I can tell you tales of like academics being super fucking territorial and bitchy about stuff. They just decided to work together, and they wrote some pieces together, and they're wonderful things. And I saw something similar here where it's like automation's such a big fucking topic. We actually can't tackle it alone. But so like instead of like, just the way you guys came together in this way, I think is really, really excellent and a model for what we should be doing. So hats off to you guys. But
Thanks.
I wanted go ahead. I mean, I wanted to say too, like, tell us about, I want to play out this historian's assumptions thing a little bit and actually get kind of specific for a second. And so I would think of this is someone you write about in the article, David Noble, right? And there's this interesting guy. He starts as a kind of Marxist historian, and then he transitions later into something else where he starts talking about religion as technology as a religion and stuff like this. But his first, America by Design, his first book, amazing text, right? It's so important. Even if you're not into Marxist analytics, you can just read it for all the stuff he pulled together, which is fascinating. Then he turns to Forces of Production. And let's think of like where he's at and like where labor history. There's like the Braverman stuff. There's all this stuff going on in the 70s, right? Where people are kind of thinking about automation. But yeah, spell it out. How do you see that moment? And then how do you kind of see yourself differently in that? Does that make sense? Jason, you want to start this
Yeah, I
time?
love that. I mean, David Noble's a great example because that's a historian I think that we both have learned a lot from, and then in certain ways disagree
Yep.
with. And for the exact reason you said, I mean, we can talk about forces of production, which is already, I mean, just from the title, you can see the sort of the Marxist angle, right? But which is not to fault it. Actually, there's a lot very useful in there, like I said. However, he
Yeah,
had this
totally.
tendency. There was a problem in the middle of the 20th century with the term automation, which is that no one agreed on what it meant. It was kind of this overarching term, almost synonymous with the idea of technology itself sometimes. And so, what a lot of
Right,
historians
right.
try to do who write about automation is to find the real automation, the actual technical thing that's happening, as opposed to this messy discourse that's, clouding the real engineering
Uh-huh,
reality.
uh-huh,
And so, I
uh-huh.
think
Right,
David
right.
Noble does that. He says it's record playback technology that's developed at GE. It's like, and then I think was numerically
Oh,
controlled.
right. Like CNC recording machines
Exactly.
and stuff like that.
This is the
Yeah.
real one. And the reason he
Yeah.
liked that, the reason he thought it was useful to write about that in particular is because that was the perfect example of what the Braverman thesis, which of course we can talk about that in a second, skilled labor being degraded, right? It's like
That's right.
and so
Yep.
like look, you can take the most skilled job in a factory imaginable, someone who's working with machine tools, right? And then turn it into a robot's job. And so that's fine. And if you want to know about the history of record playback technology, I can't think of a better history actually than forces of production.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
Amen.
However, if you want to understand what automation is as a historical subject, or if you want to explain how everyone can be disagreeing
Yeah.
about what this revolutionary technology is, then you're not going to get that from David Noble. And I think that's where Salem and I really encountered one another so productively, because we're both
Uh-huh.
finding this, And and I'll let Salem jump in just a second, but sometimes I feel almost bad about my career as a historian, because I feel like most of what I do is say, that's bullshit. That's bullshit. Like, that's not going to be my scholarly contribution to the literature. Like, that was bullshit what they said in the past, which I would like to think it's a little more subtle than that. But a lot of it kind of is. It's like, it begins as a kind of a marketing term, but that doesn't mean it's a simple concept at all, right? It's doing a lot of ideological work. And it's that phenomenon that I think most labor historians and most
Right.
historians of technology, up until relatively recently, haven't either been aware of or taken seriously or tried to actually dismiss because of those
Totally.
things.
Right. And I mean, part of it, maybe this will come up more later, but I think it's about like the way history of technology in the last decade is drawn on STS, but also history of science approaches, intellectual history approaches. I think like Eric Schatzberg's book on the very notion of technology as an example, right? So I think there's a kind of more sophisticated intellectual historical approach to these topics. Salem, what
Yeah.
just to jump in,
Yeah,
bud.
for sure. I mean, that's actually, Noble has a very special place in my own intellectual development, particularly for
Yeah.
production. And I'll actually start kind of like when you introduced Noble Lee. I actually went and got pretty much all of his papers at UMass Amherst because I was really interested when I was doing my dissertation research. One thing that's like interesting about forces of production beyond like, its analytical and theoretical contributions is that he uses the industrial robot as this technology to compare to numerically controlled machine tools. And that's one of the reasons why I actually studied it for my dissertation, because I was like, there's not any scholarly history of this thing. And it seems like it's like really important, at least in the imagination of what automation is and what it can do.
Yeah.
So I was like, all right, I want to find out what Noble found out about industrial robots, because he actually he has about two like multi-paragraph sections in the book about it. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna go find his documents, do the historian thing. Like, let's actually look at the sources he used.
Fucking A, dude. I love
Yeah,
it.
yeah. So it
Yeah.
was fun. I got most of his stuff. So I learned a lot about him as a person too, because in the process of doing it, it's all of his papers. And
Uh-huh.
actually, the industrial robot stuff, there wasn't as much on it as I would have liked, but that's okay. You
Yeah.
find little other little places to go. But he did make a switch in his career. I mean, you're both of you and probably most of the listeners are kind of familiar with his trajectory. He was a little bit of let's say unique. what's a diplomatic way of putting that? Like Noble had a little bit of problems at every institution he went into because he was kind of a firebrand. I think both in like good and bad ways, and kind of got kicked out of
Yeah.
almost everywhere he went. He didn't get tenure at MIT after actually getting unanimous support from the department. Helped start the STS program there, but
That's
he
right.
did actually switch later in his career to doing religion, and specifically his last book was going to be on gender and technology. So he had an entire thing kind of scoped out about writing a really big book on this before he passed away from cancer. But I'm like you,
That's
Lee,
cool.
like America by Design, actually to me is his best book.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And it really, even though Forces of Production is the most kind of like direct entry for me into what I was doing, America by Design, I think actually had more of an influence on me intellectually, because I really
Totally.
love the
Yeah.
institutional approach. Like he
Yeah.
did a kind of like materialism and Marxist analysis that I really, really liked. That was about like trying to like look at all the institutions that are involved in producing certain kinds of people, certain kinds of science and things like that. So that to me was super critical. But like Jason said, I had kind of, I guess, some of my own issues with Noble. It's probably, similar to a lot of other historians of technology and STS people who go back and revisit this after the decades. And that's actually where I think me and Jason kind of came together, in that Jason does such a great job with like cultural and intellectual history and like understanding the discourse of automation, where it goes and all the different like realms it's in. Obviously, his book Labor's End is fantastic. And then I also learned from that and said, like, okay, I do take a little bit more of an old school materialist approach to this, to be like, let's look at the technologies themselves.
Right.
Kind of see what they do. Is there something there about like the hard part of it, the concrete dimensions of these technologies that can tell us something about automation? And I think that's really where we come together, is that like I can.
That's you guys really complement each other. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's beautiful. I love that. And it's funny because I'm writing this essay. God, it's taking me months. It's taking me too long. And there's going to be so many fucking episodes of the show where I talk about how I'm writing the essay. It's going to be super embarrassing over the course of months. And, but I talk a lot about like, basically like those two layers of like discursive intellectual analysis and like material analysis, and how, how it's important to do both. And, it can be tough sometimes, frankly, to do both well. So I want to, I do want to give listeners a sense of y'all's kind of like individual projects too. So I wanted to spend kind of a couple minutes doing that. Salem, I got you up first on that one. So is your project still called Arms of the State, A History of the Industrial Robot in Post-War America?
So that was the title of my dissertation. At the point,
okay.
I've really gone back and forth on doing the narrower book, kind of the dissertation and manuscript, versus doing a much bigger project. And I've gotten advice both ways, so I'm still like trying to nail down exactly what I'm going to do. But I think I'm going to do just the dissertation to book. And the idea right now is, of course, just speaking frankly and kind of off the cuff, is like, do I try to position it as something as like a history of artificial intelligence and inequality? Because that's scalable, versus doing something that's more just focused on the industrial robot. And the idea behind that, I was going to call it accumulation machines. History of the industrial robot in post-war America, to really kind of draw out some vulgar Marxism, like some very productive vulgar Marxism.
Go for it.
So that the idea right now is actually to do that. In the dissertation itself, I ended that in about the mid 1980s. It's almost like a prehistory of the robot. That's like when it actually becomes a much more viable technology. And then the book would take that as close to the present as we possibly can.
And can you just say the first part of the title, Arms of the State? I mean, what's your core argument there?
Sure. So when I originally went to Michigan to do my PhD, I was planning to work with Paul Edwards, who stayed on my committee after he ended up leaving for Stanford.
Yeah.
And I had, I would say, delusions of grandeur of writing a brand new history of the military-industrial complex. And I was going to do it through computing, because that's obviously Paul's, first really big major contribution in the closed world. Was really inspirational. But of course, like any, I think, historian of technology, you quickly learn how saturated the field of computing is within history. And
oh my God.
It's just like, what, I don't know if I do. Yeah. And I don't have any like real technical competence, in CS.
Yeah.
So I was like, I don't know if I have anything new to contribute, particularly with my interest in like institutional and structural approaches. And then I stumbled upon, the project that I'm on. But I've still retain a really big interest in the military-industrial complex. And Arms of the State is kind of, it probably has like 3 or 4 different meanings, but the idea of like an arm, like a robotic arm, that's the most like straightforward one. An arm as in being like a weapon, like to actually arm something, but that has a lot of different kind of connotation to it. And then an arm also has an extension. So all these things come of Arms of the State because, I mean, just like all of us and most of your listeners probably understand, the military and the American state writ large have been so critical to the development of all kinds of technologies. But that also comes with all kinds of different like political and social dimensions to it, where it becomes an arms of the state. These things become extensions of a variety of different kind of like political economic relationships. So that's where like Arms of the State kind of comes into play.
Very nice. Salem, can you, just a little follow-up, you've kind of mentioned institutions a couple times, which I think is very interesting. I'm interested in kind of institutional analysis too. I kind of come out of a tradition of doing that kind of work. And I just wondered, like, who are important thinkers for you when when it comes to institutional analysis?
For sure. I think it's one of those things that was just like kind of latent in my own thinking, over time, you kind of sedimentation of like a lot of different things you're reading. But the really key,
Yeah.
the really key thing was Thomas Mises' article about like the meso level.
Oh yeah, I love that fucking thing.
Exactly, yeah. So it's funny that like I stumbled upon that when I first met Tom. So I went to the Charles Babbage Institute.
Yeah, he's so great,
and,
man.
Yeah, Tom was like hanging out, and kind of Tom. He's got like he's such a warm and like cool person, and he's kind of hanging out in his office. He's like, "Hey, come in, let's have a chat. Like, what are you doing?" And start talking about Paul's work and then my interest in those kind of things. He's like, "You should probably read this article I wrote." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Like, I should have known that already. Like, why am I coming stupid?"
It's not as well known as it should be by far. I should probably like write about it sometime soon. No, it's very important to my thinking.
That's the thing is that it's one of those like articles that I think that comes around that's really important that like states something that's so kind of obvious that, once it's stated, you're like, yeah, of course, why are we not paying attention to this thing? So his whole like meso level analysis was really important. And then if there's any book that like a single book that I typically always like reference, it's actually a book by a political scientist. Her name's Linda Weiss. Linda Weiss. It's called America Incorporated. And it's essentially, her argument is that the national security state, its primary function is to serve as a technology enterprise. So it's this idea that like, the Pentagon itself is actually this big driver of technological change. And that's its main purpose, is that it's supposed to essentially push forward the kind of like technological frontier. And it's a really great, it's a poli-sci book, so of course historians and like political scientists, we have our own beefs with each other, but
totally
schematically
they're wrong.
Exactly, they're always wrong until they align with us. Then they're like,
yeah, exactly. And then they're really strong.
So her book is like, her book is like really like schematically really nice. It like lays out a really nice like analytical framework, where of course I have some beefs in like her historization and like the way, but like in general I really like have appreciated her work. So that's a big one when it comes to like the whole institutional thing.
Cool, dude. I'm gonna check that out. I love that kind of stuff. For me, it's like I also I love Marx, but I also love Veblen and and Weber and Schumpeter and all those fuckers. I'm more like politically I lean Marx, but like those other guys, they weren't fools, it turns out, So Jason, now let's turn to you for a second. So you have this book out, Labor's End, How the Promise of Automation Degraded Work. Why don't you start? Can you start there and also maybe explain your kind of background and how you got into this shit?
Yeah, for sure. I started writing that book. It was my dissertation. I was a graduate student at Columbia. And originally I was doing a completely different topic, but then I got involved with the labor union, the grad workers for union.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And it was probably one of the more informative experiences for me as a historian, actually, because I think up until then I've been asking myself questions that might be obnoxious to listeners, which was like, why does history matter? Why am I doing this, etc. But then
you were in the history department, or were you in it?
And when I was there, I didn't exactly know, other than have a job. And also, I'm not sure what your graduate experiences were like, the two of you, but you go to graduate school, and the first thing we heard is like, none of you are going to get a job. And, get out if you possibly can. If you have any other desires, anything else you can do, I recommend it.
I give that talk sometimes, so you're shaming me right now.
No, it's actually really good advice. I give a version of it to my students now too.
Okay, good.
Exactly. And so, but then I was just like, why am I going to do this? But then the union happened, and it was sort of my introduction to labor politics more generally. I've just been sort of, generally left. And I began to see why history was radically important, why a person would need history to do something.
Very neat.
Yeah, and it would be in a very basic way, which is, I'm sure Salem could talk about this too, but you're going around organizing people. My beat was on the medical campus. And so I'd walk into a lab and I'd say, would you like to join our union? And because this is the United States of America, they'd say, what's a union? And so you'd have to like describe the idea of collective bargaining.
Okay.
And then questions like, has this happened in the past? People ask immediately historical questions. Like they want to know about what the future is, right?
Of course.
They ask what the past has been.
Right.
And so all of a sudden I discovered labor history as well. And it kind of, these things had a nice synergy. They worked together nicely. And the big subject in the mid-2010s was automation, actually, at least in terms of labor.
Oh, yeah.
Big, renaissance.
It was like the second machine age days, right? It was that earlier AI bubble.
Exactly.
Like round one.
Carl Benedict Frey and yeah, exactly. And they're saying like, they wrote this in 2013. They said in 10 years, half the jobs won't exist anymore because of AI.
Oh yeah, the McKinsey shit you
Oh my
guys
God.
quoted.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
crazy.
Man, they were ripping bongs left and right. I mean, yeah.
I had to review. I had to. I had the opportunity to review Frey's book for labor actually, and it was the first book I reviewed for labor. I'm like, I'm going to be very nice because I'm done with grad school. I'm done just like digging into other historians. What's useful? It's the meanest thing I've ever written. I like meaner than like a. It's like nearly like a breakup letter. But I've never been that. Certainly not in public to someone else. I was just so that book is outrageous. We could maybe we'll have a different podcast, a different episode about how crazy Carl Benedict Frey is. But anyway, so everyone was indeed talking about automation. I'm like, maybe this is interesting. I want to see what the deal is with this. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
and then I
good.
went into the record and I found that it was much more squishy perhaps than I thought it would be as a
Yeah.
concept. And basically, what I ended up writing about the subject that I found was that while there's definitely the technical dimension of what is going on in the middle of the 20th century, it increases or in productivity one way or the other. The kind of thing that's very nice to know Salem for because you can actually maybe count, unlike me. You can talk about things that actually exist.
Yeah.
For me, what I found remarkable was how sort of across the political spectrum in the United States of America in the middle of the 20th century, everyone agreed that not only was technology going to imminently abolish human labor, but that this was probably good. And everyone, I really mean practically everyone, built the idea of the abolition of labor into their politics. And they basically premised the idea of
Yes.
human liberation on the necessity of a technological surplus of some kind and the end of labor. So that's why the book is
Right.
called, in the end, Labor's End. Because on the one hand, it's like, what do workers deserve? But on the other hand, that everyone was sort of trying to get ahead of the curve. Like when there's no more human labor, what will socialism look like? Or what will a conservative America look like? What
Yeah.
will business look like? And then I found that generally that narrative, this might not be a shock to listeners at all, but that narrative generally plays poorly for working people. Which is to say, because there's another way of arguing that working people's the value they contribute is diminishing or is about to expire completely, and so that workers no longer have anything to
Right.
contribute to politics in a meaningful way. And so the general ways of reacting to this would be either sort of a doom and gloom scenario, which in the middle of the 20th century was less common than it is today, where everyone would be unemployed. Like the worst version of it you could get would be like workers would have too much leisure, which is an amazing, like that
Yeah.
kind of thing. But the other version you would get would be something like, as opposed to like too much leisure, would be finally the working class can graduate into the middle class appropriately. They can all be gentlemen, and so there are all these possibilities.
Yes.
And so what I found, the reason I found this important was because of the stark contrast between the technological optimism of the era, specifically around the role of labor, and then the harsh reality, which was that actually people's jobs were often getting worse, including, I know it's this "Make America Great Again" moment. We're all supposed to want to go back to the 50s and the 60s. And actually,
Right,
people in
right.
factories were not particularly happy with their jobs, and most of them were reporting that their jobs were getting sped up, they were getting worse. Their unions weren't as militant as they had been only a few decades before, and that you see union leaders failing time and again to negotiate their way out of this, mainly because they themselves are persuaded that in 10 years or 15 years, there won't be any work to negotiate over instead.
That's
And
interesting.
so that's the basic thrust of the book. And the ultimate upshot, I suppose, where the book comes down is that uh, a philosophy of liberation that doesn't include some role for the necessity of work is not a particularly useful definition. It's going to have a lot of problems because what you're doing is you're kind of like a Trojan horse. You're smuggling in the presumption ahead of time. You're kind of conceding at the outset that work is something that should be a degraded act, right? That only degraded entities should do it. And that's a huge concession for someone to make, especially if you are trying to represent working people.
Yeah. Well, that's great, man. And I wondered, one follow up I had for you is, well, I want to ask you about the concept of degradation and like what work that's doing from where that comes from. But I also, how do you see this history, the longer history? And I've looked at your book, but if you talk about this, I forget. But like the longer kind of like Keynes, and I feel like there were even parts of Marx where it was like this assumption that leisure would increase, and this would be part of the kind of progress arc of the economies and stuff. So how do you see that longer tradition playing into the mid 20th century moment, or do you think that's different?
No, I mean it's not completely distinct at all. You have people saying this, like Marx, right, in
Okay.
the middle of the 20th century. He doesn't explicitly say that there's not going to be any more industrial labor. But the implication is that if the state is going to wither away and people will be totally self-determining, it's hard to imagine that and a factory existing in the same reality. I think, and also he says like
Right.
freedom is the realm beyond necessity. So there's necessity for him as a form of labor often. So he's vague on the automation question, but you could kind of, depending on which Marx you're talking about, you could see how a Marxist like Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s would say Marx is all for automation. It's not a crazy interpretation to make. But I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, like if you look at like the utopian technological socialists of the last quarter of the 19th century, a lot of them gave some position for work. Work would exist to some extent, but it would be really good. I mean, even someone like Edward Bellamy is saying like you'll work until you're 45 and then you'll be retired. So they're
Okay.
generally building in some way that people will be contributing with labor. It's just the labor will probably be like nice, will be good in some way or another, even if the labor is necessarily going to change. At the same time, there are a few early signs that this is changing. So one of them is actually, strangely, you can see it in what, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, Oscar Wilde's essay, where he's like, only slaves work, and that in order to live, yeah,
Wow.
really,
Okay. Right.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and he's like,
Nice.
and
Yeah.
socialism will essentially produce mechanical slaves, so we can all be kind of what like human slave owners, and it'll be moral. So you begin to see people making this argument.
H.G. Wells maybe too, right? I mean, shit like that, where there's like the, I don't
Yeah,
know. Yeah.
well,
Go keep going,
no, for
Jason. I
sure.
love
No,
this. I love this
oh no, for
angle.
sure. But the thing is, the kind of distinction that I make, is and also like Paul Lafargue saying the right to be lazy, this kind of stuff.
Uh-huh.
But where it's different is that no one in the labor movement certainly argued that, and generally labor struggles were not arguing for the abolition of labor.
Right.
This is a socialist tendency. It was also technologically utopian, but for the most part, workers, especially in the U.S. or at the turn of the 20th century, are calling for shorter hours. It's the same pay. They're calling for workplace regulation. They're calling for safety, these kinds of things. They're not saying destroy our
Yeah.
jobs or we shouldn't have to work anymore. They're trying to find ways to reconcile freedom and work. And the general way that the industrial labor movement eventually comes to that in the 1930s is by saying capitalists will own the capital, right? They'll own the machines. You workers through their unions will own their jobs. And this is how we'll like square the circle with this business. So
Got
job
it.
holding will be integral to the creation of a middle class, right? We don't want to get rid of the jobs. Industrial jobs will make us all possibly middle class. It would have been crazy for them to say, let's get rid of this. Where it begun, the moment where it starts to change a little bit is in fact the 1930s, which is also the moment when you see militant industrial unions really sowing their oats and becoming legally recognized, something like the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. And what changes there is the basic argument that one of the explanations for the Great Depression was that the economy had quote unquote matured, capitalism had matured, it reached the end of its progress. And this is where you get someone like Keynes actually saying, now that's all that's left is to sort of try to retrench, make it make sense. Find like there's no more progress. Everyone who can buy a Model T has bought a Model T. And now we just have to figure out how to basically redistribute the industrial plenty that we have. And so that's one aspect of it. But even then, the labor movement doesn't really get on board with it, and workers aren't calling for it. What does change, however, is I mean, this is my argument, and you two, I'm actually curious to hear what you have to say. What kind of sets off the automation discourse as sort of a truism of the post war political scene is, in fact, the major technological breakthroughs that happened over the 30s, but also the Second World War. But more importantly, the way that American capitalism seems to save the world in World War II. The immense sort of like the validation of industrial capitalism is one, something that will produce plenty, that can produce enough armaments, right? Something like the Ford Motor Company produced more material than Italy. I mean, that's a crazy argument, but it's
Oh yeah, no, it's
yeah,
bananas. How many tanks we sent over there and shit. And we just buried them in material. That's why
exactly.
that was
And then, of course, the
yeah.
technological
Yeah,
breakthroughs of the year, like one after the other in quick succession, right? The splitting of the atom,
totally.
creation of electronic digital
Yeah.
jet, and all these things. So it was sort of feasible to think that actually, we might live in a society where actually private corporations could produce or appear to produce with government funding the technology that will bring about something like a proletarian revolution without the revolution. And the great example, and then this is like an intentional
Very
campaign
interesting.
by corporate
Yeah.
America. So like 1934, 1935, DuPont changes its motto to better things and better living through chemistry. You look at the 1939 World's Fair, like basically corporate America is,
Motorama and all these
yeah,
things,
they're
Futurama.
arguing, right, that they will bring the future. And this is extremely persuasive. So there are actual material changes that seem to ratify this. And then, of course, the fact that
Yeah.
1940s is a time of reaction, and the labor unions did not take over the country. They did not actually gain workers' control. And so I think it's in this environment that something like the automation discourse, which had been a subtler discourse, had been a tendency among some on the left in particular, now becomes dominant. And it seems to make perfect sense. If technology can do all of these things, private corporations can be this politically important in world historical terms. And if there's this ongoing tension between capital and labor that's always causing all this chaos, maybe we can technologically solve this problem too. And that's the moment.
Yeah.
That's why I argue it's not exactly a break.
I like it.
It's like crystallizes then.
Salem, just go from there. I mean, Jason, you're just like, you're setting up my whole fucking script perfectly. So let's just keep going. Salem, yeah, just riff. I mean, like, take that where you want to go.
For sure. Yeah, I'll build off, and I'll jump back to something too I was thinking of when Jason was talking. So I think this is like really cool how me and Jason work together too, is that he has such a level of like understanding, expertise of everything he just discussed, and then it literally just goes directly into what I study. So it's like perfect, like in terms of like that we have our own periodization, like in our work together as colleagues. So it's at this moment that I think it's like really critical to understand too, that particularly like what I study most directly is like the auto industry, because that's where industrial robots have been the dominant habitat for those up until 2021. The majority of industrial robots that have been sold around the world have been in the auto industry, and it wasn't until 2021 that they finally started 51% get sold outside of it. And then, of course, the very idea of what we consider to be automation tends to come out of the auto industry as well. There's like what was called Detroit automation, or like hard automation, things like that. So this is right in the moment that Jason's talking about, particularly like in the 1940s. The term is actually coined in about 1936, then really takes off in the late 40s with Della Harder and his automation department at Ford. And I think what's like really interesting about the labor dimension of the discussion is that what essentially happened with the Treaty of Detroit in 1950, the really big kind of agreement between the UAW and General Motors, is that because UAW had such a powerful influence on the broader labor movement and on unions in general, and the way they kind of had certain kinds of industrial labor relations, is that contract set the pattern for all kinds of industries, right, across the economy. And what that essentially did is that allowed capital, and GM specifically, to control their machines, their forces of production as they saw fit. And then the union itself would just bargain over essentially labor share of income, right, benefits, wages, those kind of things. And I think it was in this moment that it's building off of the 1930s, right? It's kind of coming after the Wagner Act, trying to figure out how are unions formally and legally finding their place, both within the broader political economy, but then also trying to negotiate internally what their strategy and tactics are going to be, particularly in terms of like militancy, where are they going to push, where they're not going to push. And with the Treaty of Detroit, what this does is essentially locks labor in to a particular kind of technological contract as well. It's essentially saying that corporations can develop and deploy technology as it sees fit, and then the labor movement is going to react to that. They're going to react to the technology itself. And one of the reasons why what happens in World War II is...
So the alternative would be having some role in making technological choices, right? This classic kind of like bringing democracy into the workplace.
Yep. And it was
right.
Yeah. And the negotiators on both sides were pretty explicit that was not going to be an option. That was like one of the things that was taken off the table, is that we're not going to do this. It was a kind of industrial democracy, business unionism. Like they understood what the rules of the game were. Right? And that's Luther's big switch in like the late 1940s is kind of coming around to this. So that's critical. And the thing with World War II that Jason brought up that I think is really important is that by 1945, when the war ends, Mark Wilson talks about this in Destructive Creation. Literally within the 5-year period or so that the United States is engaged in actual like doing the arsenal of democracy, that's the largest investment in both human and concrete like capital in human history. And at the same time, every single competitor in the capitalist marketplace has essentially been destroyed. So
yeah, exactly. Fucking A, dude. We dominated there for a while, right? I mean, it was, yeah.
It's actually kind of amazing. Like, this is one of the things that I think actually, maybe I am just not familiar with the literature, but I don't think it's been studied enough to.
I do not think
it
so
really
either.
has not, because
No.
if you
Yeah.
think about, like, coming out of the war, that the United States almost has zero competitor. About 50% of all actual like manufacturing production is coming out of the United States. The rebuilding of Europe is so dependent upon those kind of like the transnational relationships, the building of Japan. So what happens is like there actually was this kind of like peace dividend that's coming out of World War II that I think plays a huge role in the way that labor and capital are going to be essentially working with each other. And when automation really comes to the fore, any kind of like positive or negative effects of this, whether that's like a technical thing, whether it's just like a political perspective or discourse, you almost don't have to deal with it until you get into the late 50s and in the 1960s. Like when I've been like looking at these things, it's because of this kind of like peace dividend during this period, is that there is just so much wealth to essentially be accumulated in the United States, helping to rebuild the capitalist world. And then all the technologies that come out of that you actually don't start to have any real like competition that's going to start putting those kind of like those forces are not going to be really pushing against the average American worker until you start to get into the 1960s. And that's like the pre-COVID like stagflation in the 70s, is that finally you have competition from Germany and Japan, that at that point, once I think you kind of get into the 1970s, then our ideas about automation completely change. I mean, the whole like automation hysteria, as they called it, that was going on in the 1950s and 60s, it almost disappears by the late 1960s after Johnson's big blue ribbon commission, the Triple Revolution. I mean, by 1968, Johnson he gave a speech where he essentially said like automation is no longer a problem. Like that's no longer our thing. Like we don't worry about it anymore. So it's kind of interesting, like looking at the longer kind of like, I don't know, Kondratiev waves of these things, is that like.
Yeah. I mean, it's like Amy Sue Bix's like book on technological unemployment. This is something that just keeps coming back around. I think we could probably do a kind of systematic. We could do like the Kirsch and Goldfarb in their book on technology bubbles. They look at like 90 technologies and look at what causes a bubble to develop. They have a theory around it. I think you could take all the technological unemployment waves and like put them together and really do a kind of systematic comparison about what's going on in the economy, what's going on politically, all this kind of shit. And, I think they would all be unique in their, there would be things that were unique about each of them, but it really does feel like some kind of recurrent thing, right?
Well, it's because industrial capitalism remains industrial capitalism, right? It's like, as much as there's this talk of like this industrial revolution or that industrial revolution, actually, you should know this better than anyone, Lee, because you write about the new economy, right? Where it's like we're doing. If you look at like the substance of it, like the ideology behind the new economy, it looks like almost not exactly, but like point for point, pretty similar to what people were arguing in the 1950s and the 1960s about what the economy would do.
Totally.
Right?
No, I was thinking about that while reading your article. Actually, it was like so stark, and like a lot of this shit comes back around in the 90s. I'm actually writing. I have a essay I'm revising on Robert Reich and human capital policy in the Clinton administration. And like just the idea of structural unemployment and shit, which is like is deeply interwoven with technological unemployment and these ideas and automation, comes back. Like Reich is like using that term in footnotes and reports he's publishing, and so like the idea, even the economic concepts, they'll fade away and then they'll come forward again because it's like, yeah, totally. Guys, this shit is so fucking great. I want to go. There's so many places I want to go. But I have like at least two big things. And there's so many things I want to ask you. And we don't have that much time. All right. Well, have you guys read this book, Samuel Milner's Robbing Peter to Pay Paul, Power, Profits, and Productivity yet? I think you guys should both check it out. I read it because I was on a prize committee for the Business History Conference. I think he came out of Yale history, and now he's at University of Chicago. He might be a legal historian. I can't remember where he's at in Chicago, but he has this really, you guys would love it. It's all about how through these, Reuters agreements and these kinds of things, like unions, and he looks at the auto industry, steel, and the electronics industry, and he shows how like there were these wage productivity agreements, basically, right? Which is very much tied to all this shit. Is like, like that workers productivity is going to be great for everybody. It's going to increase profits. It's going to drop prices for consumers, and it's going to give like a set portion to workers who are going to benefit from speeding up, basically. And I mean, I think that you guys, I want to hear your reactions just to that idea. I mean, I think you guys really nicely show the degradation of work and how it's like speeding things up, making things shitty. It's rearranging kind of labor stuff. But then the other thought I had, and this is like, or this is going to take us down a certain road, but that's maybe a great system. I think you guys are showing it's not a great system, but that could be a great system if you're going to have a lot of productivity gains. Yeah. And then through Robert Gordon and other people, we know that like, oh, that shit's about to hit the wall in the 70s, right? And then there's like big questions. So I just wonder, like, your guys' reactions to that.
Jason, go for it.
Oh yeah, sure. No, absolutely. I mean, I'm just thinking of that. I know I really want to read that book. Obviously, it sounds fascinating. Because the only thing I think Galbraith said it like in the 1950s, which is like today it sounds like such an audacious thing to have said and so off the mark, which was that we don't need to worry about equality anymore because we have so much. The questions of distribution no longer make sense, right? Everyone is basically rich.
Right.
This tide that raises all boats. So basically saying that problems of hierarchy are no longer issues because even the bottom rung of the hierarchy is doing so well that why would you care that someone's contributing? Right, which in like for our moments is so wildly off base, especially
exactly.
It might still matter.
There's no sense of where things are heading, whatsoever,
or even what's going on in the moment,
or even what's going on. That's right.
So there's this like way of thinking, but on top of that, something that I do find interesting, and it's actually troubled me about writing about automation. And I bug Salem about this a lot, and he has a very good read on it. I won't put him on the spot, but it's like, okay, one could argue is that like there are these real material changes to the economy, and the changes how things work. At the same time, as I keep talking about, perhaps like automation as like a discourse is kind of dare I say misleading, right? Where it's on the abolition of work is what you're talking about. What really sinks American industrialism, sinks is maybe a strong word, what challenges it, as Salem said a moment ago, is increased international competition, right? The United States gleefully participates in building back its global competitors, which is such a weird story. It's such an interesting thing to have done, but they did it. And now if you look at, when things are being offshored, there's going to places that have alternate technologies. China has a lot of robots, but it also has a lot of cheap labor. But it's the same old mix of industrial.
Yeah, sure.
However, also there are increases in productivity too, right? There is a technological, I don't want to say impetus. I don't want to sound like a vulgar Marxist, but sometimes productivity doesn't match with technology perfectly as you would like. Like with computers, it didn't seem to have a wonderful...
They're interwoven at the very least, though. Let's be fucking real, right? I mean,
exactly. So, like, how can you argue? So for me, the thing that I continue to find sort of difficult is like, how can you sort of argue that this is a discourse, but at the same time, productivity increases are also real. They also actually do happen. And so, and that's actually a question. It would seem to be not technologically determinist exactly, but I don't know. It's like people are making changes to capitalism that do produce more. And even if those, we're living in a moment where the productivity isn't as high as they said it would be when we're talking about this in the middle of the 20th century. But nevertheless, I find myself kind of going around and around in circles by saying like and maybe this is my problem as a historian of both labor and technology, which is I don't want to be a technological determinist. But it seems like the things do matter. This is called peoples and things.
I'm an affordances guy. I think shit actually fucking matters. Yeah. Machine tools revolutionized how we made shit on the planet. And, and so affordances are my way out of the kind of determinism, constructionism trap, Because I think that, just to your point, like why corporations are choosing through R&D labs and all kinds of shit, right? The creation of these units you guys write about. They're putting human attention into automation because they see potential benefits of all sorts from it, right? And so, and a lot of times it doesn't pay off as much as they want it to. We know that. That's true of AI and shit too, right? There's hype, there's bubbles. But they're doing it because economies of scale are real. It's as real as anything, and we can talk about prices and all that kind of shit. Salem, you go. You see what we're talking about. You have angles on this too.
100%. Yeah. And like Jason, you can put me on blast anytime. It's all good. Like,
let's do it.
Let the listeners into me and your debates. It's all good. No, I think The way you started out, Lee, is actually what I think is kind of interesting is that it's one thing I look at like kind of the granular level is the connection between like wages and productivity, right? That has been like kind of
Right.
like that connection. And to me, it's a devil's bargain, right? Because what happens is that if your wages are dependent upon higher productivity, that can come from essentially two different places. I'm sure there's maybe other, but there's two dominant ones. You
Yeah.
either work harder or there's more efficient technology that you're working with. If you work harder,
Yeah.
well, that's literally what unions were essentially created to prevent. They don't want you workers don't want to be overworked. They want to be paid a fair wage for what they're being paid for, more leisure, all those kind of things like that. Right. So you have that side of it. But then if you have better technology, there's only so much demand in the economy to soak up what you produce. So therefore, if you have better and more technology, then you're going to need less workers to produce a certain volume of output. It's going to be soaked up by the economy. And this gets into like, this might be a whole other tangent we can maybe save for later or on another podcast, is like the whole like overcapacity, thesis and like talking about.
Right. Well,
That's
no,
kind
we
of stuff,
we should just say that now,
Yeah.
which is we've already set it up, which is, I mean, Brenner and then, his students like Aaron Benenev,
Yeah.
like what you're saying is like the U.S. helps their eventual competitors in the wake of World War II, like ramp up their industrial production for a variety of reasons, right? I mean, it's partly aid, it's partly about capitalism and fighting communism. It's all this shit, right? But then there's only so much demand. Then you ramp up all the industrial capacity around the world. You have all these Japanese products, eventually Chinese products. That's like where this is heading, right? I mean, you guys agree with that? Is that what you're saying, Salem?
Yeah, I mean,
is that part of your picture?
That's generally like what I'm getting at too, and I think it's kind of what's interesting about that is that, for instance, like the overcapacity thesis. One of the reasons why I think actually automation becomes really critical, and like why I love Aaron Benenov's work, but also like my take on it is that automation, whatever that may mean, like we're going to talk about in the most like conventional kind of concrete sense, automation is a component within the production of over industrial capacity. Right? Literally you're making capital investments in machines that can produce more for less. So that's part of a contribution to it. So that becomes its own problem, trying to figure out. But then again, we're talking in like this really kind of like high meta level. And when you start to actually, I think, kind of like parse it out, I actually just like pulled it up real quick. This is so Nat Weinberg was like essentially Walter Reuther's like right-hand man in the UAW. And in 1956, he gives this speech on automation and tries to figure out a taxonomy of technological unemployment. So he gives 4 different versions of this. He says there's external displacement. So this is the one that like almost everybody pays attention to. And that's like a new machine goes in and then like a worker goes out, or like, so many workers. There's internal displacement. So that's within a firm itself. So that worker stays.
I think that's very common, like at universities and stuff. When we automate someone out of a job, we just shift them to a different role.
So there's internally within the firm itself. Then there's competitive displacement. That's if another firm becomes more efficient than this firm. So think about like, the way Chrysler was always catching up to GM and Ford. Then there's what he calls opportunity displacement. That's like the economy-wide shrinkage of certain kinds of jobs. So you just don't need as many people to produce as many cars. I would say there's actually probably a fifth. And the fifth one actually becomes really critical in the over-industrial, the capacity question. That's automation in other countries. So when that's part of like the opportunity displacement or like the competitive displacement is that when technologies developed in the United States get shifted over to Japan because of a variety of different kind of geopolitical relationships, the Japanese can then become more competitive. And that has an entire effect on the United States, has an effect on Germany, everybody who's involved in this. So there's like this interesting kind of like David Harvey, Neil Smith, like you're kind of like moving the crises, you're moving automation around. And that has this huge effect on like how employment is going to work globally, right? But at the same time, you're having shifts in the very composition of the broader economy from like manufacturing into service work. And the critical like dimension, I think, in that shift is that manufacturing for decades had been unionized. Service work overwhelmingly has not been. So the relationship between workers and their work, they now don't have institutional or structural like capabilities to engage in the same way that they do in the manufacturing spaces. So when automation starts to take place both in manufacturing and in service, there's these different kind of political economic relationships that are involved about how people can respond to these things. Because it goes all the way back to kind of what Jason was talking about in the 1930s, is that what happens to the worker's ownership of their job when they don't actually have any kind of apparatus to enforce that, right? This is like the neoliberal argument, is like, now you're all thrown on the market and you have to fend for yourselves. And then when you're dealing with something like that, like this huge scale of like, how is an individual worker going to essentially engage with artificial intelligence, whatever it is or is not going to be? Like, you can't do that. And there's a really good example that just happened recently. I live in Los Angeles with all the writer strikes, right? They specifically talked about artificial intelligence in their contract. I actually got to look at it while they were bargaining it, right? So they were very specific about like how a technology is going to be used. And while I think there could be some more constructive approaches to the way they did it, to me, this is actually a really critical point. I know this is like not history now. We're talking about like the present. But to me, like, this is where history, like Jason was talking about, with like labor unionizing and organizing, kind of informs the way we look at this. Is that we have an opportunity now with like the writer's strike, about they were very explicit about like how technology can be used. And to me, if we're going to have any conversations about what automation is going to be in the future or what even it is, it has to start from that position about like how people are being affected by it are going to play a part in actually its management.
When that happened, when they made that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but when the WGA made that demand, I mean, my knowledge of like labor demands over the past 150 years is far from perfect. But at least since World War II, not too common that unions have said we want to have a say over productions, what they call production standards, over the kinds of machines you can use to do the job. That's exactly what they sacrificed in the Treaty of Detroit, right? But let's say how the job happens. I was like, I can't think of too many, other unions that have tried at least.
My read on that moment, though, was that was in response to what they're being threatened with. Because, like, the companies were bringing AI, threats of using AI into the discussion of the contracts, right? I thought it came from, like, the corporate side first, and then, the union was responding.
Well,
basically. That was my read.
What's actually really interesting about that is that this, I think all of us know, and most of the listeners are going to know, like, artificial intelligence is just a marketing term. It's like a hype term. It doesn't actually describe anything.
Yeah, it's fucking bullshit. Yeah, I mean, thank you.
What's actually really fascinating about like what you just said, Lee, is that the very hype of AI came back to bite the studios, because they were talking like, oh, we don't need writers anymore. Now we need AI.
Yeah.
And then the writers were like, well, but you do.
Yeah, but the union didn't get that demand answered. Like, they made this big demand, like, you can't use AI. But then the actual contract says, like, all right, if you use whatever it is, it's just probably a chatbot they're imagining. But like, if you use it anyway, like, we still get writer's credit. You can't take money away from us, which is kind of like, it's not like a slam dunk win at all. They didn't quite get what they wanted.
And that's like my critique of it too, is like why I'm like, it's not like solid per se.
Well, and that's a fascinating, go.
Well,
Jason.
the other thing is that, I don't know, do you guys know this book? I read it recently. I wish I'd known about it earlier. It's from 2022 by Moritz Altenried. It's called The Digital Factory. It's really, I mean, it has a really cool argument, and it links into like automation. And it might not be surprising to, you have it right. Yes, it might not be surprising to us, but it's just useful having say this, which is like, one way of talking, there are many ways you can talk about technology, but in the setting of industrial capitalism, one way you can talk about it is that it's property. And what he basically argues is that the sort of service economy, like digital platforms, far from being like a new frontier of labor, what they've actually done is they've taken the factory model and they've spread it to jobs that formerly would have seemed resistant to the ability to like be like a factory. So like, delivery service people, or something like, taking surveys on Amazon Turk or anything like this. They say beforehand, like, maybe you could have called this like digital piecework. People do call it digital piecework. Well, his argument's actually a little further, which is like what you used to require in real space, right? The ability to regiment people, to coerce them, to have them work according to pace, to have a kind of a tailor's motion control over what they do. Now, like, digital platforms have basically been able to take that model of organizing workers and regimenting them and to bring it into people's homes and to the street. And so, in fact,
it's true.
Yeah. So, in fact, what we're seeing is like this weird sort of win-win for capital or lose-lose for workers, which is that you actually get the kind of regimentation of like service workers that they would have if they were working in the factory.
Yes.
However, they also
Yes.
have the flexible contracts of people who you usually associate as not working in factories,
Yeah.
because like the standard,
Right.
Florida's thing is that you have a very regular job until you're laid off, more or less. And so it's like the worst of both worlds. But at the same time, it's like it's far from any kind of like deindustrial, post-industrial thing. In fact, it's just like what these systems are doing is they're just doing what Harry Braverman said in 1974. It's like everything gets industrialized, everything gets turned into factory work. And I find this thesis to be rather persuasive, actually. And so, while at the same time, it's like with overcapacity, really what I see like of all these like different ventures into AI is like how can we basically one thing that they're really working towards, I think, is like how can we just continue to turn all work into basically factory work. And anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, because it's applying this kind of automate. I mean, you're standardizing and automating and in all those classic ways, right? I mean, is that part of the picture?
Indeed, and also like in this case, often what's called automation, and this is I don't mean to keep veering off into this tangent, but like what's called automation in this case, right, is like surveillance, like it's a platform that actually, a what they call AI, these algorithms or machine learning, or we can try to define it. But this truism that's come out, which is that these systems are really much better as bosses than as workers. They're very good at like surveilling people and like regimenting them, but when they have to do the work themselves, they kind of
Yeah,
suck at
yeah,
it.
yeah.
For the most
Well,
part.
you know why? That's because it's easier to automate bosses'
There you
work than
go.
it is to automate the fucking work. So take that, fuckers.
Exactly.
You know,
But like this, you're talking about overcapacity and stuff, which is like okay, so like
yeah,
you see capital desperately investing its money in all these like crazy and generally not very remunerative ends. Like Twitter doesn't return money at all.
right.
You can't get any of this profit. But the thing that actually might just get a return is just like doing what they used to do. It's like okay, instead of actually having a technological revolution on the order of the second industrial revolution, which still has been unsurpassed in terms of how many innovations happen in such a short amount of time. Why don't we just do what we've
That's
always
right.
been doing? We just have to find a new niche of unindustrialized work, non-industrialized labor, and we can apply it there. And that's why it's like that's one of the reasons I think for all of this hype, because they actually know they're not inventing the light bulb. I think they actually know they're not electrifying the societies. Nothing on that
Yeah.
order.
Well, and it has to do with what drives
Yeah,
investment.
yeah,
I
of
mean,
course.
my take is like financialization and neoliberalism, and a lot of these things happen in the 80s and 90s are about corporations like in an era of low productivity and low profit growth, like chasing something, right? And then you get these recurrent tech bubbles and shit, but they actually don't get the benefits very often, but they're constantly looking for these ways to profit. And like you're saying, like, squeezing labor is always on the table as like a major way to get that done. God damn, I wanted to talk to you guys about the civil rights movement. I think it's really, and I was thinking about David Stein at UCSB, who's been writing about like structural unemployment and full employment in the 60s, and how that, these worries about automation are very built into the civil rights movement in maybe surprising, fascinating ways. I want to talk to you about Lordstown. My God, we could go on about fucking Lordstown for like 3 hours. Let's just do a Lordstown episode someday. Because to kind of wrap things up, I wanted to know like where you guys are at. Obviously, Salem, you're gonna you're working on this book and you'll get that done eventually. Jason, you've already started working fascinating stuff on race and technology. I looked at one of your pieces on black obsolescence. So I wondered, I mean, to kind of set in is there anything left on your guys' agendas related to this topic, like automation going forward? I mean, you guys kind of set an agenda a little bit at the end of the piece, I thought, saying like, we need to investigate this more. But I also wondered about your own work. So whether it's agenda setting for the crowd or just what you're up to, I just wonder about the future and where you're headed. So Salem, can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, it's obviously, getting that first book out, and like automation is
Hell
going to
yeah.
be a huge part of that, since it's about robotics. And also too, like me and Jason, I'm sure it's okay that I kind of mention this. Me and Jason have been talking about doing an edited collection with each other, about doing like, a big history of like labor and technology and like automations and
Cool, dude. Count me in.
Yeah,
I'll do something.
for sure. And
You're on the hook.
yeah, you're on
yeah, it'll be on me. Everyone hears it. I'm happy. Whatever. Yeah, cool.
And the other like kind of more pie in the sky project that I had for like my bigger book, it's like I would actually like to write a really big book on the history of automation in the U.S. that is really expansive in terms of like both blue and white collar work.
Yeah.
And it would be like really kind of bringing together history, technology, and American political history. That's kind of like one of my bigger kind of, I guess, intellectual goals with this part of my career is that I really think these two kind of domains need to be talking to each other because they're actually talking about the same thing most of the time and they just don't pay attention. So that like down the road would be like the really big thing I'd be working on is like a history of automation. So it's going to be on my radar.
That'd be fucking great. We could use that
for sure.
Yeah. So that'd be kind of a survey. And yeah, I mean, you know, one of the reasons I think about this, I'm writing this Good History of Shit Jobs book, which is about financial or like, you know, economic hardship at the household level in the United States. And so I'm writing a lot about deindustrialization, automations in there to a degree, and then like the whole question of like the productivity paradox and, you know, like why services are like less productive. They get less productivity growth in the services. You know, the whole Baumol issue around services and all that kind of shit. So that comes out in the Clinton stuff. So anyway, I mean, as I write this kind of history of that period and these automation questions and technological questions, I just say that I totally agree that I really think we could use a survey history of both the thinking around these things and the actual material realities and what the fuck's going on.
Yeah, real quick too, like you because you mentioned deindustrialization, your book on that. I want to throw this out there too, just like something I've been thinking about a little bit, is I actually think that the term deindustrialization is a misnomer. If you actually
it's terrible.
If you start to dig into like the numbers on these kind of things, the actual like value added of manufacturing in GDP in the United States it's been essentially between I think 11 and 14%, like for 100 years. So it's like really fascinating the way we talk about deindustrialization.
Yeah.
Really, that's just a word for saying the loss of good unionized jobs. Like, but
and how it affects cities,
and of course, the spatial dimensions of that, and like, so there's all kinds of things that are tied into it. But I always like whenever I hear in deindustrialization, there's like a little like warning.
Yeah.
It's triggering. Yeah, no. I mean, I'm writing about this in the project actually. I mean, like, you know, U.S. manufacturing output peaks in like 2008 actually, and so you know we have gains that whole time. Yeah,
I mean, it's a little like I don't know, John Baptiste Frazos, I think his name is. Anyway, he's got this argument like energy transitions are like similar. It's like, you know, we're using more coal now than we were using. And so the idea that we're actually
it's agglomeration
exactly, and that it's actually what we're referring to when we talk about energy transitions are actually political orders and like how political orders orient themselves around different kinds of energy. I think you could say the exact same thing. I think Salem is absolutely on board. I'm absolutely on board with him. I think he said the exact same thing about industrialization, right?
Yeah. And Jason, how about where you headed with this shit?
Yeah, I'm heading back in time. I suppose historians are supposed to. I'm kind of
going back.
I know. And like, you know, and I don't know, there's like different. I don't want to get too in the weeds here about the job, you know, the gig. But there are two different approaches to what do you do after you write your first book. Like, do you write like the sequel, or do you do something completely different? Like, and so I seem to be doing kind of both, or doing neither. I can't quite figure it out, but. As you alluded to this essay that I wrote about Black obsolescence, and basically, I don't want to take too much time telling the story, but like one of the notes I got back when I was finishing up the manuscript for the book from the publisher, and this was in the middle of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests, was like that the treatment of African Americans and this automation story was sort of superficial. And on the one hand, I found this very frustrating, but you know, take these things very seriously when someone makes this argument, because I thought I worked extremely hard to talk about civil rights and automation. But I realized I kind of sort of said, I'm going to write the history of automation, or the automation discourse is a better way of putting it. And I want to see how these different constituencies look at it. And so one of those constituencies was, you know, different wings of the civil rights movement. But when I got this note, I thought, like, what if I were to actually invert it? What if I were to say, like, I want to write the history of, let's say, like, African American workers in the United States, and automation is going to be a chapter of that history instead. And actually, that revealed something that I hadn't considered before, which is the importance of racism in the idea of mechanization. I hadn't read enough about that. And so the new project, at least the provisional title in my mind, is and this is I kind of don't like this title at all. That's how it's sort of the thesis, which is like it's called "The Slave is the Model," which is that there are different that mechanization presumes a degradation of labor, And if you look and so I was like doing some research in the 19th century, and oftentimes the comparison between machines and enslaved labor it comes right to the tip of the tongue of all these Americans, right? And in fact, slave labor long precedes mechanization in terms of modern conditions. And I can't help but notice, like especially in the middle of the 19th century, you have little slave owners saying, like, "Well, I could use a machine to replace this enslaved worker because I understand these things to be synonymous." And so
Right.
I'm not a reluctant, semi-reluctant Mumfordian. I really like Lewis Mumford with all the critiques to be made of all the things.
He's got a lot of issues, but I love him too. I mean, I'm deeply passionate about him, even though I think he's fucking wrong about so much shit.
So much. Actually, like Fernand Braudel has this amazing takedown of Mumford in like the History of Capitalism series.
Who does?
Fernand Braudel. And it's like, he's like,
nice.
I'm sorry. And he's just like, I won't go into the whole story of what he was wrong, but Braudel's like, here's the reason, because I've been in the archive and Mumford hasn't, why he's wrong, but still such an interesting idea. And it's like, this is Mumford in a nutshell. It's like, even if he's wrong, he's still very interesting. Anyway.
Yeah.
But, Mumford has this argument about mega machines and such, that the first machine is the organization of human beings as though they are willless, and that machines are modeled off of this. And I'm like, I wonder if there's something to that. And I kind of see like a distant reflection of that idea in like mid and early 19th century mechanization in the United States of America, and that the presumption that what machines will do is degraded labor, and that the model for degraded labor is enslaved labor. And then very quickly people start saying like black people are like machines are like black people, because they mention enslaved labor and black people.
Yeah.
And then it goes in all these other directions that I found really surprising. One of them is like during the sort of these hearings in California ahead of the Chinese Exclusion Act, labor unions are making the same argument about Chinese workers, like they are basically machines.
Holy shit.
Yeah, wild stuff. And so I'm like, okay, there's something, some kind of. I want to start either like a very long article or hopefully a short book. That's always the dream, right? And that's
yeah. Both are good. Both. We need more long articles. We need more short books. We need more novella length things in our lives. You know.
So real quick, I gotta connect this to Jason, exactly what he's talking about. This was like one of the things that like really set me off on like a really important avenue of my own research. Gentleman named Joseph Engelberger, considered the father of the industrial robot. This is him in 1974 as a quote, "Since we can't have slaves or kick around black people anymore, the robot serves that purpose," unquote.
Holy fuck.
Exactly. So when I came across that, I was just like, okay, I need to start thinking about this thing in a different way. And that's actually how I discovered Jason's work, was when I came across the myth of black obsolescence. So it's perfect connection.
Okay.
Amazing.
So then I asked Salem for this reference. I'm like, can you tell me that? Because I read something that he wrote. And I was like, okay, I'm going to read he sent me the article, but I was like, I want to read the whole thing. And so I go to the Library of Congress and I say, can you send me the magazine that this was in? And it turns out the magazine is We, which is a pornographic magazine that was like meant to be like the highbrow Playboy.
Ooh la la.
And so like all of a sudden, and then I got like, are you sure? Do you want full pictures? I'm like, of course I want the pictures. I had no idea what Me magazine is. And so I get all this porn from the Library of Congress. And the picture to this article is amazing. It's like two robots having sex. Anyway, but this is just another example of why you should collaborate and not cut turf, people, because you learn from your colleagues. You learn.
And I found that pornographic magazine in the Stanford archives, which is just fantastic.
Someday I'll tell you the story about how the rare books room at the University of Illinois, where I was a student worker, had the complete collection of Playboy because Hugh was a graduate of the university. But before we get into that, I think we should probably end on the happy note of like what we're going to talk about later, maybe, and this wonderful, just another kind of hat tip to collaboration as opposed to turfy bullshit. Because I think so much rich stuff comes out of thinking together and learning from each other and the different approaches. And you guys have done that in spades and, kind of give us a model to follow. So thank you so much for coming on to take the time to talk to me today, you two. It
was a blast. Thank you.
Yeah, I had so much fun. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at sts_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.